the first episode, we have been discussing the genesis of the first concept of five. In this episode, I would like to discuss the genesis of the second concept of five. As we have discussed in the first episode, the first concept of five and the second concept of five are equally prevalent and equally important and can only be understood through one another. We also discussed that the first concept of five has been created first and the second concept of five has been created later, and that there's a causal relationship between the first concept of five and the second concept of five. We believe the first concept of five has been created first, and we believe the second concept of five has been created later. Why this causal relationship between the first concept of five and the second concept of five exists is what we discuss in this episode. Here you can see a direct juxtaposition of the first concept of five that we already have discussed and the second concept of five. The first thing that we can say about both concepts is that they are both a trinity, since they both exist out of three directly juxtaposed objects. The key difference between the first concept of five and the second concept of five is where the partiality is positioned within the trinity. In the first concept of five, the partiality is formed in the very center object of the trinity. In the second concept of five, the partiality is formed in the most superior object of the trinity, meaning that the both absolute objects are directly juxtaposed next to one another. Because both absolute objects are directly juxtaposed in the second concept of five, they directly engage with one another. Because both absolute objects in the first concept of five are separated from one another and are not directly adjacent to one another, their engagement is only indirect and does occur through the partial object in between as a mediator. This, in and of itself, does not explain, though, why there's the need for the genesis of a second concept of five. If you look at the second concept of five, you realize that the second concept of five is an alternative configuration of absolutism and partiality. It is not just an alternative configuration of partiality and absolutism. It is the only possible alternative configuration of absolutism and partiality, meaning the second concept of five is nothing but an alternative possible configuration of the very same concept that we have discussed already. The possibility for an alternative configuration of absolutism and partiality does demand the actual realization of it. As I pointed out already, the first concept of five is the precondition for the creation or the genesis of the second concept of five. Because without the configuration of the first concept of five, no alternative configuration could ever have been created. That's the key reason for why there's a causal relationship between the genesis of the first concept of five and the genesis of the second concept of five. When it comes to the second concept of five, there are two options in which an alternative configuration of partiality and absolutism can occur. Either both adjacent absolute parts are in an inferior position, as you can see here, or both directly adjacent absolute parts are in a superior position, as you can see here, meaning the directly adjacent pair of absolutes take the upper levels of the hierarchy, not the lower levels, like in the first option. Yet only the first option on the left side is the only option that is feasible, not the second option for the second concept of five. Why? The second concept of five implies exclusivity, because the pair of absolutes excludes the partiality. Exclusivity does imply that the excluding actors, meaning the two absolute objects of the trinity, must be in a position of inferiority. Therefore, the exclusion of partiality must occur in upward direction, meaning the pair of absolutes must be inferior. This is why we can conclude that the second option for the second concept of five that you see here cannot be an option, meaning only the first option that you can see here can be realized. In order to differentiate both concepts of five from one another, meaning the first concept of five from the second concept of five, I would like to introduce new terms. I would like to introduce the terms totality in exchange for absolutism and neutrality in exchange for partiality. The function of totality and absolutism is the same, and the function of neutrality and the function of partiality is the same as well, meaning that the neutrality of the most superior object of the trinity is paramount with hybridization and is therefore comparable in its function with the partiality of the first concept of five. Unlike in the first concept of 5, both complementarily opposite objects of the trinity are directly juxtaposed, as you can see here, and are therefore in direct engagement with one another. Because both directly juxtaposed objects are of complementarily opposite nature, both are averse to one another and exclude one another in a desperate attempt to artificially create distance in between. The mutual aversion that occurs between the two inferior total objects is distinctive only to the second concept of 5. And as you can see here in the first concept of 5, no direct interaction between the upper absolutism and the inferior absolutism can take place because of the partial center object of the trinity in between. The partial center object of the trinity does allow only for an indirect engagement between both complementarily opposite objects of the trinity, and therefore serves as a mediator. Because both complementarily opposite objects of the trinity are not directly juxtaposed, they cannot be averse to one another. The mutual exclusivity of both total objects of the second concept of 5 and the aversion of both objects towards each other creates a conflict. The conflicted relationship between both objects manifests convergence on the one side because both objects are forced to engage with one another, and divergence on the other side due to the aversion of both objects towards one another, as you can see here. In the very same manner in which the first concept of 5 exists out of a trinity on the one side and a quaternity on the other side, so does the second concept of 5 exist out of a trinity as well as a quaternity that can be viewed through the 5 dimensions of the overarching quintinity, as you can see here. The first object of the lesser duality, or the inferior totality, is being viewed through the first dimension. The second object of the lesser duality, or the superior totality, is being viewed through the second dimension. Both objects of the lesser duality are situated within the first object of the larger duality, which is being viewed through the third dimension. The first object of the larger duality is directly juxtaposed to the second object of the larger duality, which manifests neutrality and which is being viewed through the fourth dimension. In the very same manner in which an additional fifth dimension had to be added to the first concept of 5 in order to view both objects of the larger duality at the same time, so must an additional fifth dimension be added to the second concept of 5, meaning the additional fifth dimension is artificial, since it does not naturally form. In the very same manner in which both objects of the lesser duality are being viewed through the third dimension, so are both objects of the larger duality being viewed through the fifth dimension. And in the very same manner in which the lesser duality is smaller than the larger duality, so is the third dimension smaller than the fifth dimension. Because the third dimension does naturally form, it is natural, unlike the fifth dimension that had to be artificially added. As we have discussed already, both dualities only exist as a duality. If one object of a duality ceases to exist, so must the other object of the duality cease to exist as well. Because the second object of the larger duality is being cancelled due to its neutrality, so must the first object of the larger duality be cancelled as well, as you can see here. In comparison to the first concept of 5, a cancellation cannot take place because the partial object is situated in between both extreme objects and is not being excluded, and therefore has to be regarded as an integral part of the trinity. As you can see here, the function of the third dimension does shift. Originally, the third dimension was designed to view the first object of the larger duality. Now, after the cancellation of the entire larger duality, its function is to view the lesser duality only and not the first object of the larger duality, because the third dimension does totally suffice to view the entire second concept of 5 after the cancellation of the larger duality. The second concept of 5 can also be called the concept of 5 viewed through the third dimension, because the first concept of 5 does not allow for a cancellation of its partiality due to it being an integral part of the trinity. The first concept of 5 necessitates the fifth dimension as a whole to be viewed, and is therefore being called the concept of 5 viewed through the fifth dimension. I'm going to use these terms interchangeably. this is it for today's episode. In the next episode, we are going to talk about actual applications of the second concept of 5, or the concept of 5 viewed through the third dimension. See you then, and as always, God bless.